All right, let's start to do some desktop sharing here. And that looks good. Okay, so I think we have about 45 minutes minus a little bit. And I thought this was an interesting challenge that the team put together here to kind of cast this as an RFI to some degree and to try to ask this very wide variety of vendors to do a response with only limited detail on this fictional agency. So I did the best I could, and we'll see what you think. I thought it was an interesting exercise, so we're going to go ahead and dive into it. So I work for a company called Appgate. We provide zero trust network access, where in my role, I'm Chief Product Officer. I also have a couple of volunteer roles outside of that, or I should say loosely affiliated with that, where I'm one of the co-chairs of the Zero Trust Working Group with the Cloud Security Alliance, and Appgate is fortunate enough to be one of the vendors participating in NIST's NCCOE Zero Trust Architecture, so I'm participating in that. I am an author of a book called Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide, which General Tuhill was kind enough to write the foreword for. And I'm going to be doing this from a mostly industry-neutral perspective, with a little bit of Appgate's view in here, hopefully only a little bit. I was really heartened to see General Tuhill talk about the OMB recommendation is not as a gospel coming down from Mount Sinai, since there are a couple things here in the deck where I criticize it a little bit and question some of the motivations or the approaches. The way that our product architecture has been delivered for customers is one that's fully aligned with what's in NIST Special Publication 800-207, with a set of centralized and globally distributed policy decision points, which might be deployed into our vendor cloud environment or to customer managed environments, and a set of distributed policy enforcement points, which of course are deployed into customer or enterprise controlled environments, things that we call gateways. Most of our customers choose to deploy our solution with a user agent installed on the device. For the majority of users, and for a minority of users, they might use a clientless option just with browser, or they might choose to use a server-to-server, or what we call a headless client running on a server. We also support IoT use cases. So this is kind of just framing this up. All customers have enterprise identity providers, and they use that for authentication, both for users or in some cases for some of their servers if they're using certificates in some cases. And most customers in their deployments will, of course, tie it into lots of the other elements of their enterprise IT and security infrastructure, SIEMs and endpoint management systems, et cetera. Appgate as a company is a software solution provider. We're not a consulting or implementation company. So there's areas that personally I didn't feel confident responding on project timelines and budgets and things like that. The deployment model that we're talking about here, this is obviously from 800-207, largely follows the Enclave Gateway model. And this seems to be most common in the industry. I'm not talking about just Appgate, but many vendors follow this approach for a variety of reasons. And the gateways and the resources that they're protecting, of course, are not just in cloud environments. For almost every customer that we see, they're a combination of on-premises traditional data centers, as well as newer cloud-based environments that have to be protected. And the gateway model lends itself to this notion of what's called an implicit trust zone that's called out in 800-207. And the idea, of course, is you want to get that as small as possible. But when you're starting out, there might be some kind of volume or scope to that. And that's one of the challenges that organizations have, is if they don't know what's on their networks, then this implicit trust zone can be fairly large. And in the case of VPNs, of course, the implicit trust zone is everything on your corporate network, which is not very helpful. One note is that this model depicts a direct connection from the user device to the gateway. So this line here in the middle would be encrypted and secured and direct. Other models that many vendors support and that some customers choose to deploy is what we term a cloud routed model, where actually there's not a direct connection between the user agent and the gateway, but the user agent connects into the vendor cloud. There's some sort of transit through the vendor cloud, and then there's another connection through the gateway to the target resource. There's pros and cons to using that approach. It's kind of orthogonal to what we're talking about today, but in all cases, there's a logical connection here between the agent and the gateway, which is the policy enforcement point. So these tenets, of course, are from 802.07, and I just put them up there as a reminder. And what I tried to do was to look at the as-is fictional agency defined in the requirements for this to give us a way of looking at this. So this is kind of what it looks like. So they've got 4 identity providers that are defined. They don't have integrated or consistent use of multi-factor authentication. There are several high-value assets, which I denote in green here, and I assume that they're going to be spread across different environments. They've got traditional, of course, enterprise IT networks and OT networks or OT resources that are on our standard IP networks. And they've got some SCADA-based systems that are presumably on non-IP networks that have to be secured. And they have siloed security operations centers and SIMs. And I kind of extrapolated a little bit based on experience with our customers. So it's likely that they've got a 26-year-old VPN with all the things that are wrong with it as a single entry point. And that way that our user there in the middle gets access to resources across that VPN tunnel is then that traffic subsequently needs to go across some sort of wide area network. It might be an MPLS or some other mechanism, and transit across that to get to these other resources. And there's lots of reasons that that's a bad idea. The organization probably doesn't have a good configuration management database or good asset inventory. That's pretty common, especially for these enterprise environments where you have things that have been running on the network for decades and people don't really know what they are, or what they're supposed to do. They probably have inconsistent change management processes around that. Hopefully, they have more defined and better controlled and documented ones for the high value assets. Chances are they don't have those in place for many of the other lower value or unknown assets. Probably have multiple secure web gateways, probably traditional ones that are deployed on-prem. They probably have multiple device management or endpoint detection and response systems. And they probably have some sort of on-premises network access control system that's used to do some sort of limited or coarse-grained access control. Obviously, those only work in on-prem environments where they're in physical control of the hardware. It's not applicable to the cloud-based environments up in the upper right. And of course, it's completely isolated from the remote access used by a VPN. So that's a pretty traditional set of challenges for many, many organizations. If we look at what a to-be architecture around Zero Trust might be. So what we have in this picture is a couple of new icons here. So we have the policy decision points. That's a combination of the policy engine and the policy administrator shown in the upper left. And that's can be anywhere. It's deliberately shown just kind of floating in free space there because it really doesn't matter where that is. And that's used as a mechanism for identity authentication through that to the identity providers. And what's interesting about that is that actually serves to normalize identity attributes. So it can help extend the life or reduce the urgency to consolidate and get down to a single identity provider. The policy decision point also, in a well-done Zero Trust environment, would have both data and event integration with things like a configuration management database or EDR or SIM, things like that, in order to be able to get this additional context around the user and their device, as well as to be able to receive events when something happens, such as an endpoint management system detects anomalous activity on a user device, or a DNS system says, hey, this device just made a request for resolution of a known bad domain. We should do something about that. And of course, the something is up to the Zero Trust system to perhaps quarantine the device, or perhaps end a session, or perhaps prompt for MFA. The enforcement points are shown with this switch icon here. And the idea behind that is that we no longer have a backbone that user traffic has to traverse. And really what we've done is we've logically put the user at the center. And you can see the user is the hub, and we have these secure connections from the user's device acting as the spokes that go to these gateways, these enforcement points that sit in front of the resources they protect. So this is exactly the Enclave Gateway model that we talked about that's depicted in 800.207. And what this does is it immediately takes this user's traffic off of this wide area network. And we've seen, for example, customers be able to significantly reduce the amount of traffic and the amount of spend that they have on MPLS connections just by doing this. The other thing is, you'll see the user here in the lower right, is that even though this user is on premises, they're in the building in this example, they're still going through, whoops, excuse me about that, excuse me. But they're still going through the policy enforcement point, and they're still authenticating through the same policy decision point. So the beauty of this is we no longer have this silo between on-prem access control, logic and policies and technology, and remote user access control. There's one system. And that really is very well aligned with our Zero Trust tenets of all users, all resources, all the time. The other thing is that the SCADA systems should be accessed through a policy enforcement point as well. And that's depicted by these blue lines on this diagram. And we'll talk about that. So next up is the areas in the requirements here to talk about. So what I've done is in the upper right in the gray box, I copied what's in the SEI requirements here. And I'm talking about each of these in terms of what we can and we should anticipate on implementation here. So if we talk about MFA, first of all, so most identity providers can and do enforce MFA during the authentication process, which is great. And oftentimes they have sometimes good and sometimes limited capabilities to base that on user context, and those should definitely be incorporated. Zero trust systems, must be able to tie into that because you've already invested in an identity provider for your enterprise. Your users are trained. You have the client software deployed, maybe on their user device, or their mobile device, et cetera. Clearly, the zero trust system needs to connect into that. And the good news is that there's some great standards nowadays that work pretty well for integrating with those, whether it's SAML or OIDC. We also want to have the policy enforcement points to have the ability to trigger step-up authentication based on the context. So if we go back to our diagram for a second, the policy enforcement point that sits between the user's device and the resource they're accessing, clearly that is the mechanism, that's the piece that knows a given identity is attempting to access a given resource. It needs to have the ability to say, oh, based on everything I know, I need to ask this user for an additional factor for authentication. So that needs to be part of any dynamic zero trust process, policy and platform. The policy enforcement points, they're intercepting the network traffic, and in some cases they might be proxying it, in other cases they might just be routing it, but in all cases they are on the network and they have the ability to block this, and they must have the ability to control access to things at an application level, which is distinguishing between a system administrator trying to RDP or SSH to a system and a regular end user trying to just access a web application through a browser. And I struggled a little bit with the way this is worded in the memorandum around network versus application layer. And really, there's a little bit less of a distinction, I think, in a zero trust system, because in my mind, the policy of, the principle of least privilege needs to apply equally to an application and the network. So clearly, a system needs to understand who I am and what my role is, and whether I'm authorized to have access to a given application, which means, do I have an account provision? Can I authenticate to it and log in and do some work? But that needs to be tightly bound to my ability to access it at a network layer. There's absolutely no reason for me to be able to pull up the login screen for an application in my browser, or even to send a network packet to a system if I don't have authorization to log in and actually do work in that system. That is a violation of the principle of least privilege, and it's also a security risk. There's so many instances of abilities for remote access, vulnerabilities on critical applications that don't require authentication, that we have to be able to shut that door. The good news about that is that the applications themselves, if they're done well, first of all, they'll be using your enterprise IDP for single sign-on, so they don't have their own identity provider. And they also can rely on the combination of that identity provider and the Zero Trust system for MFA. So the applications don't even have to worry about that. I want to talk about centralizing identity management next. So the memorandum doesn't actually say, hey, you have to get down to a single identity provider. And this is an interesting discussion I've had with a number of customers around this. And it would be great to have a single identity provider, but that's actually shouldn't be the default or only goal for this. What the memorandum requires is that these identity systems or all identity providers be centrally managed, so that as long as you've got your applications that are using single sign-on or some other mechanism to leverage a centralized identity provider that's run by your IT and security team, run by your identity team, that's a sufficient goal. There may be perfectly good, valid reasons to remain indefinitely with multiple identity providers. And as long as they're centrally managed and monitored, and especially if the Zero Trust system can act as a normalizing layer for those, then that's a perfectly acceptable state of affairs. So overall, you should try to reduce the number of identity providers you have for cost and operational complexity reasons, but the goal isn't necessarily one. Goals should be as few as possible, but as many as necessary. From a device perspective, clearly, you've got to know about your devices. In this case, devices refers both to end user devices as well as systems that are on the network. This is often hard for traditional on-premises networks. It's a lot easier for newer environments, whether they're virtualized environments or cloud-based environments, because those systems by definition have a rich set of APIs. You can interrogate them. There's a whole industry, a whole sector of the industry of vendors putting in place cloud-based inventory systems, cloud security posture management, those types of things, because those things have very rich APIs. But the hard part is, in many enterprises, they don't know what's on their traditional network. And that's just something we have to say, okay, well, we don't really know this, but we need to work over time to reduce the scope of that. In terms of endpoint devices, the RFI doesn't specifically mention this, but I think we can assume that they have some sort of endpoint detection and response. That's probably okay. And clearly, one of the goals is to make sure that there's mechanisms for probably some combination of on-device agents as well as remote scanning or validation of those agents, of those user devices, to build up a profile of user device health. And the policy decision point does absolutely need to tie into those systems one way or another to get, we'll say, an objective view of the relative health of a user device. And it can be as simple as, hey, this is a risk score that my endpoint management system is returning, or maybe the Zero Trust system has a local user agent that can do some deeper interrogation, or maybe it's just, I want to make sure that my system has, any of the latest 3 operating system patches. In terms of network devices, we're going to cover that in the network section. Zero Trust recommendations around network are spelled out pretty well in some of the documents. So clearly, you want to use network traffic encryption wherever you can. They also recommend using encrypted DNS, so DNS over TLS or HTTPS. And the memorandum talks about email encryption as a future, since it's a little bit too clunky today. Clearly, there's cases and situations where it makes absolute sense to do deep packet inspection, to do TLS termination and investigating and looking at the traffic. In other cases, it may well be sufficient to look at just the metadata for the traffic for a variety of reasons. Likewise, on the DNS, I think I'm a big fan of having systems that look at DNS queries, assigning some risk to them, clearly filtering out known bad domains, but also using that as a trigger for taking action. Network segmentation, clearly you want to get to the point where you do have your workloads and data isolated in as small segments as possible. And it's easy to say, but in many cases it's hard to do because you've got an interwoven set of interdependencies on the network where you can't just change IP addresses or segment things off until you have a very clear understanding of what is talking to what needs to talk to what, under which circumstances, and that you're not breaking things that are in place. But I will reinforce that I really believe that the ability to send a network packet to a destination is a privilege and needs to be treated as such, and that we need to move away certainly from the wide open networks, the ability for a device, whether it's a non-malicious user, a malicious user, or a compromised device, to have full network access to do port scanning, reconnaissance, and ultimately lateral movement. We'll start with the easy one if we dive down to the three areas of the network. So if you look at our SCADA systems, clearly those are non-TCP networks. There's some sort of broker that's going to sit between the TCP IP network and the devices on that network. And the goal with Zero Trust is to put a Zero Trust policy enforcement point in front of that broker and make that the only trusted connection, or the only available connection to and from the SCADA broker in that case. So now we have the ability to have hard network level enforcement of traffic both to and from those SCADA systems. And that allows us to do some interesting things. One is clearly we can and should prevent or restrict outbound access from the broker to known locations, whether it's internal databases or maybe vendor upgrade sites to upload, or excuse me, to download additional firmware, to be able to enforce things like maintenance windows so that those systems can't reach out except and unless this is planned. Likewise, on the inbound side, that's important as well. I mean, clearly we want to restrict access to only known and authenticated identities, probably enforce MFA. We can even have the ability to tie that access to a business process. One of my favorite use cases is preventing access to a system on a network until and unless there is a service desk ticket that's assigned to that given user. It's a really nice way of making security a byproduct of a business process that you want to follow for lots of different reasons, and being able to enforce it at the network layer so there's no way to bypass that. And then finally, there is an interesting side use case around the break glass situations, which is you do want to have the ability to say, okay, we've got some sort of problem, and I'm not talking about a security incident, but maybe it's a production problem with the manufacturing system. The ability to say, okay, we need to turn this thing off temporarily so we can do some troubleshooting and really get things back online. From an OT perspective, these are devices that run on our standard enterprise TCP network. And they might be segmented in a lot of different ways, and it's going to be very, very dependent on the enterprise. If you're lucky, they're well isolated into something like a VLAN or a network segment, or even just a known and contiguous set of IP address ranges. In those cases, it's a lot easier to understand what a device is, and to be able to put a Zero Trust policy enforcement point on the network to be able to both capture that traffic and control access to that traffic. You might also have mechanisms that use something like NAC using 802.1x for both authentication and identification of those devices and some sort of crude, or I should say coarse-grained access control. The hardest situation is when you've got these devices that just have random IP addresses. Maybe they're using DHCP, or maybe they're fixed and assigned, but no one's really tracking them. Maybe they're in a spreadsheet somewhere that's 75% accurate. Clearly, you've got to know what these devices are, what they're supposed to connect to, and what's supposed to connect to them. But with all that in mind, you can still apply the same sort of Zero Trust policies, controlling access to what they're allowed to access from an outbound perspective, as well as who or what is allowed to access them. Understanding and getting a clear view of what they are is the first and the biggest battle in many cases. From our standard IT networks, the memo, the OMB memo, doesn't go into a lot of details. It simply says, hey, create a plan for this. And I'll emphasize kind of the first steps here from the NS TAC report around defining what they call the protect surface and mapping your transaction flow. So clearly, you've got to know what's on your network and what should be talking to what in order to have some sort of coherency around the policies. The good news around moving to this model is that it generates some sort of side benefits of now you're reducing the complexity of your ACLs, whether they're firewall-based or VPN or NAC-based. And what you're really doing in those scenarios is saying, okay, we're going to have a really simple set of firewall rules that says we're going to allow all traffic as long as it's coming from or to the Zero Trust policy enforcement point. And now you've gotten out of the world of that really impoverished 5-tuple vocabulary and now have a policy model, a policy language that is identity-based and contextual and a much richer way of expressing what you need to do. Clearly, in this case, you'd want to probably start with the high-value assets. Hopefully, they're already set up on the network in a way that is known and hopefully segmented, but clearly you'd want to put those pretty immediately as a first priority behind your zero trust policy enforcement points, enforce MFA, enforce device checks, and start enforcing the principle of least privilege around role and attribute-based access control to those systems. Data is definitely a challenge here. The optimal state that's defined both in the OMB and in the system maturity model is pretty sophisticated. And many, at least in the private sector, most enterprises are not nearly far enough along in terms of understanding or categorizing their data, let alone enforcing it. So I think this is definitely a little bit more of a future state around zero trust. And what I would really like to do is see where we can get to the point where these zero trust systems can make this identity context available to applications and DLP systems to use as input into their decision-making process, because ultimately the DLP system or the application knows its domain best. So even something as simple as a user's geographic location or a confidence level or a risk score about their device, that could be really interesting and useful for a DLP system to be able to say, oh, this user is in the United States, great. They can see all this stuff that is authorized based on their role. This person is outside the United States at the moment. I'm going to not let them see this certain data, or I'm going to obfuscate it in some way. So I think that's an area of future work, both for vendors as well as for the overall standards community around defining vocabularies and mechanisms for making this zero trust context available across these systems. Applications and workloads. So this was not part of the RFI, but I think it was important. It is important to put in here. So clearly, having application security testing programs, having immutable workloads are solid and reasonable recommendations that most organizations should strive for. But I think the other things they do talk about are the other things that I think are applicable here are having the ability for the zero trust system to enforce step-up authentication based on user context and workload sensitivity, attribute-based access control, enforce both at the network layer as well as potentially within the application, and securing workload to workload or server to server communications. And this might be traditional server to traditional server, or it might be using newer mechanisms like Kubernetes and being able to enforce zero trust from a containerized workload across some intermediate network to another workload. We really believe that all of these components, servers or even containerized workloads, let alone, of course, users, should be identities in a zero trust world. They should be identified, they should be authenticated, and they should have authorizations assigned to them, and that authorization should be enforced within the infrastructure. The thing that I think is wrong and at least misguided in the OMB memo, what I was glad to see General Toohill talk about areas of concern there, is this notion of making internally facing applications, quote unquote, fully accessible over the public internet, where they say without relying on a VPN or other network tunnel. I think this is a really bad idea that needs to be rethought for a variety of reasons. We all access SaaS applications every single day, whether it's Microsoft Office or Gmail or other things that are business applications or related to our mission. And those providers, those major corporations, have architected their systems, and that's in their entire business. So they invest a tremendous amount in making themselves resilient to DDoS attacks, making the front door, the entry to their enterprise, well protected. And agencies and enterprises, that's not their business. And I think it's a terrible idea. It's a completely unnecessary violation of the principle of least privilege, completely unnecessary increase in the attack surface to make these internal applications directly accessible over to the internet. They should not have that exposure. There's no reason to expose the authentication page for your application to malicious state actors. That's just nuts. The right thing is put them behind a zero trust policy enforcement point, make them inaccessible to unauthorized users, make sure they are accessible to your authorized users with all the appropriate controls around that. In terms of roadmaps for the project here, I think that looking at this and obviously not knowing specifics about the organization, I would say something reasonable to aim for in the first 90 days is build out your plan for a plan. Establish your zero trust steering committee, which is going to have representatives across different areas. Obviously, people within IT, networks, identity, security, but also stakeholders across the organization to make sure that they're involved in this. You should absolutely perform a maturity assessment, and the CISA maturity model is a good start. But I think it's got to be down to a fairly fine-grained level of detail. And I think that having a maturity model, sorry, I think I have a slide for this. When I talk about the 31 functions, what I'm talking about are these areas here. So this is obviously a screenshot from the CISA maturity model. And this happens to be for the network pillar, but you can see they've got those 6 different functions there. And that's the level of detail, at least, which you need to be analyzing and scoring yourself as an enterprise, because just saying, hey, at the identity level, we're a 2 out of 3 is honestly not that useful, because everyone's going to be a 2 and everyone's going to be stuck at 2 for years. So what you need to do is get down to a fine-grained level that says, okay, encryption, great. Here's where we are in encryption, or governance capability around networks. Here's where we are with that. Sorry about that. During the first 90 days, organizations should also have a couple revisions of the architectures and identify candidates for their first 2 zero trust projects. Get a baseline of your inventory, and there's going to be things that you don't know, but at least document them and say, okay, we know about this, we don't know about this, and now we're going to start hacking away at this and beginning to document what's there. Likewise, establish baseline knowledge of where you are with your identity providers and the set of processes and services and integrations around those. The sidebar on this is I've been thinking a little bit about zero trust metrics and thinking about what a maturity model looks like. As I mentioned, I think you have to go down to this next level of detail and have metrics that are specific to your organization. They're something that are meaningful and measurable, and ideally are driven by automated data collection, because you can clearly, through a Herculean effort, put together 25 metrics. But if it takes you 2 person weeks of work, it's not something you're going to be able to update every month. So this, I think, needs to be something that is kind of analyzed and negotiated, but tied to things that are meaningful to your organization. And here's some examples that I've seen customers use that work for their organization. So the number or the percentage of help desk tickets each month that are tied to access. That's something that's really measurable. And I think it's very clear with an organization says, you know what, on average, prior to this, we had 200 access related, password reset, whatever, tickets a month, and we reduced that to 20 because of this change. Huge improvement, measurable. Everyone's going to have a party around that. Other types of things that we've seen customers improve on are average time to provision access for a user. And we've seen organizations move from weeks to days. And in some cases, you can go to just hours. And again, this is by looking at things holistically and changing the processes around that. Likewise, percentage of servers with admin access secured by zero trust. Maybe even you say, what percentage of our servers have no admin access? Because if we're using immutable workloads, maybe there's no reason to even enable that. That might be useful for your organization. Okay. Recognize we're almost out of time here. I've got about 3 more slides, so I'm going to go a couple minutes late. What's reasonable for the organization to accomplish in the first year is have a commitment and aim for getting full visibility of the set of assets on your network, and have a process around this, whether it's technical or manual, whatever it is, to make sure that 100% of new workloads and devices and systems are tracked and tagged and categorized so that your asset inventory stays up to date. absolutely within the first year, you should have your zero trust architecture not just defined, but rolled out. You should have multiple projects that have completed and delivered value. And you should have a regular cadence of the zero trust steering committee. And you should also have, number one, progress on the metrics, and number two, general refinement and I would say additions and changes to those. In year two, if things are running well, you'll have all your new projects fit into the zero trust architecture. And the flip side of that is that your zero trust architecture will grow to accommodate new projects, new technology, and new maybe changes to the mission or changes to the approach. You should have measurable progress on your overall organizational maturity, and it should have a really demonstrable and both quantitative and qualitative positive impact on security and user experience and efficiency, resiliency, and hopefully your SOC effectiveness. You should also be deliberately working by year two to expand the scope and the edges of your zero trust initiative and have a fairly sophisticated degree of automation and integration with other elements of your infrastructure. So I mentioned the service desk ticket example as controlling access. Another example is your SIM detecting anomalous activity on a network or for a user device or for a server. Those should also be tied into your zero trust systems. Later on, as organizations get more mature, clearly you want to make sure that you keep your eye on the ball and at the basics, there's no backsliding, that this program ensures that everything new falls into the zero trust set of measurements and monitoring and deployment, and that whatever new technologies or network topologies are put in place, that you have a plan for deploying your zero trust policy enforcement points in front of those, and that the policy model that you have is tied into and effective for those environments. In terms of user experience, zero trust can and does deliver something that's improved for users. You're getting away from all the headaches associated with the VPNs of having to remember to sign in, having it conflict with various things. It just becomes a much more transparent, always on type of user experience where you just turn on your device, maybe you authenticate, maybe it's using a cached access token of some sort. You access your work. Occasionally you're prompted for MFA. You get more or less access depending on various attributes. And it just becomes a way that users work. You should also see lower network latency because you have direct connections. You're not having to transit a wide area network. And things should just flow. And ideally, you'll be able to reduce some of the existing manual processes for access request and approval because you're tying it into attribute and role-based access control. And then finally, we've seen enterprises, I've certainly seen enterprises across the board of different size, different scope, be able to use this effectively. Everything from a 250-person organization to hundreds of thousands of users. Obviously, they do things a little bit differently, but there's many things that they have in common. So I think that even though this is a fictional agency, the challenges that the SEI put together are going to be universal and shared across all of those. And I think that to close out here, that taking this approach with zero trust, it's important to remember some of the tenets from 802.07 around securing access for all data sources and all communication and all resources. And fundamentally saying our zero trust system is going to need to be holistic and universal for all of our users and all of our resources, helps unlock and gets rid of a lot of complexity because now you're getting rid of silos, you're getting rid of the traditional gaps between things like application level security and network level security. So with that, I know I'm a few minutes over. Thank you all. I'm happy to take questions now or to follow up. My contact information is there. Thank you for the opportunity to present, Tim.
Jason, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hey, so great presentation. Really like the breakdown. One question that I thought it was a pretty interesting interpretation that you had around the applications and workloads pillar. And I just wanted to make sure from an industry perspective that we're setting the interpretation of the clause on accessible via internet. So the way that I've read the clause, the way that I've seen that interpreted is not that the FSMA moderate system would go onto the internet. So we wouldn't just take a system and just blindly put it on the internet. The interpretation is to use zero trust principles to start allowing access to that via the internet. So I think it's a pretty big distinction, and I think it, kind of goes to General Toolhouse, to start using zero trust principles today. Specifically in 2209, the next paragraph talks about that being an event for people to start and then get confidence in following these systems. So just wanted to make sure, is that the interpretation that we have, accessing via the internet using zero trust principles, is what we think this intention of the mandate was?
That's the spirit of it. I think that's the right spirit, absolutely. It's, some of the language is definitely troubling, which prompted my rant there, right, where it says, without relying on a VPN or other network tunnel. To me, that implies having this thing directly exposed. I think your interpretation of that approach is absolutely right, and this probably is worth having some refinement from the authorities or the authors of those documents.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback and the discussion. It'd be good to follow up too. And I don't know if there's a way that something like this can be clarified, but it would be worrisome if a federal government agency read that clause and took the interpretation of on the internet, because obviously that kind of fundamentally goes against the intention of all of this. So yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a good point for everybody to be aware of as we're having conversations to help clarify this with our customers, that we can encourage people to start using the principles today. Yeah,
absolutely. So I see Paul here queued up for his next one. Thank you for the question. I'm happy to continue the conversation online. Reach out to me on Twitter and thank you again.